Hello again, I'm Eric Sperling. Thank you so much for joining us on All in Education's Sepas. And I'd like to welcome today's expert panel. We have Jeff Zetino back with us. He is Director of Research and Policy at All in Education. Jose Patiño is with us today. He's the Vice President of Education and External Affairs at Aliento. And Karina Ruiz de Diaz, Executive Director at Arizona Dream Act Coalition. Before we get to the panel, a little bit about All in Education. All in Education is a local nonprofit organization that exists to build an Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Now, their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. Now, through this monthly Sepas series, All in Education is working to bridge their advocacy efforts across multiple factors outside the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. They're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Now, Sepas will focus on having real, thought-provoking conversations with leaders and community members and identify solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. Now, today's conversation will discuss the topic of immigration. Now, while there may be differing opinions on immigration and what the best solutions are for the country and the people it impacts the most, there is one reality, and that is how deeply impacted immigrant children and children of immigrants are on a daily basis. So from ever-changing policies to stresses caused by uncertainty of having their family separated, being deported, and many other factors that have major impact on the daily lives of their families. So because of these factors and more, the academic outcomes and opportunity gaps for this population of children have been negatively affected. So before we get into today's panel, we do want to share a story of personal experience. Here's Victoria's story.
Hi, my name is Victoria Villalba. I am an Adelante Fellow, and I am also Instituto's Data and Research Coordinator, and I'm an Arizona native, and this is my home. One of my earliest memories related to immigration was going back and forth to Mexico. So my parents are from Mexico, and my dad's from Sonora, and I remember going there and visiting family. I also remember going to the beach. I loved going to the beach. I remember the code switching that I had to do from being coached by my parents of, we're gonna speak Spanish, hablen español, we're going to Mexico, don't be flashy. We would get all of these kind of cues of how to be present in Mexico, and also we're taught that this is part of who we are. Like, these lands is where you're from, this is where we grew up, but then we were also always reminded that education was really important from where my parents came from, and also them reminding us and showing us this is where you're from. Mixed status family is when a family has different statuses in the United States, and these can include folks that have visas, that are citizens, that were naturalized, that are undocumented, or that have DACA, or a different array, because there's many statuses that folks can have here in the United States. And growing up in a family that was mixed status was really complex for me, because as a very young person, I received reminders almost daily that people that spoke Spanish, that folks that ate specific types of foods, and that came to the United States most recently were not welcomed. There were derogatory terms said in school, and I clearly remember having a conversation with my dad. I'm like, Dad, what does this mean? A couple of students were told this term, what does it mean? And he's like, oh, it's because they don't want us here. Es que no nos quieren. And that sat with me. I'm like, how is it possible that in school I'm receiving a message about being unwanted when the whole idea around schooling is to be more inclusive? So being part of a mixed status family and community made me realize, hey, I have privilege because I am a US citizen, and I have a responsibility to be able to use that for good. Being in a state that's been very hostile towards immigrants or folks that are undocumented, it has an effect that really marks like young people's lives. A student can be, in their classroom, and then they go home and their parents are deported. That's real in Arizona. That has been real in Arizona. And there's a huge disruption there that happens to student learning. If you're not part of this community, join the conversation by being a listener, but also listen for understanding. Talk to folks in your community or plug in and learn. I invite folks to remove back this political lens that really oversteps the richness of migration, the beautiful cultural piece of it, the things we can learn from immigrants, from our students who are immigrants. There's not a deficit lens there. It's how we invite them into the classroom and how we interact with them. Immigrants in general, people in general, are experts of their own lived experience, and we can learn so much from each other if we remove some of these lenses or some of these perceptions that punitive policies is what's going to help us solve many things in this country.
What a setup for today's conversation and panel. So Jeff, let's start with you. Let's talk about some of the implications that immigration has on student outcomes and talk about how that's connected to some of the work that you're doing at All in Education.
For sure. There's definite outcomes that we see within the data, but I really wanted to start this conversation and preface it with the United States Constitution mandates that every child that enters a school receives an equal education. So that's regardless of citizenship status, migrant status, or even undocumented status. If you're in that school, you deserve a world-class education. And my parents immigrated from Mexico City and El Salvador, and they were undocumented here, and luckily I was born in the United States, but they came here to give me a shot. And within the schools that we all got educated in, that shot was continually more and more and more difficult for being part of a mixed family, but also being undocumented which was a lot of people within my community. And in Arizona, I think this video alluded to it, there has been this "you're not welcome" climate being developed by policies that have been passed. Specifically, English-only language, the mandate that Arizona governments use English only, and that separates our community from programs and resources and institutions that are there to serve the whole community. Also, SB 1070, we saw the chaos that SB 1070 introduced into our communities. And more recently, immersion language mandates that take the student out of the classroom area for this non-research-based practice that teachers have to deal with. So all of that, it should be no surprise that we're seeing that within English language learners and their ELL proficiency rates. So right now in Arizona, we have an 11% ELA proficiency rate within migrant students. And when you look further into the data, you see that 10% of the students in Arizona that are part of the special ed population, the special ed population in Arizona only has 10% ELA English proficiency. So we're seeing that there's not failing students, but that there's a failing system within the Arizona education system.
So Karina, let's have you share your story. We just heard from Victoria and Jeff, your story, your personal experience, and help lay the foundation of what immigration in Arizona looks like from your perspective.
Yes, I was born in Estado de Mexico, in Tlalnepantla. My parents are from Oaxaca, and that was the first time that they migrated, looking for better opportunities. We came to the US when I was 15 years old. And I knew some English because they somehow understood in Mexico that education was the way to get out of poverty. And they wanted me to learn English because my siblings' friends were getting opportunities that my siblings were not getting because they didn't know English. And I hated English. I remember I had to go to Saturday to learn it. And I was like, this is useless, pointless. Like, I don't need it. Little did I know that I was going to end up here. When I came, I knew some English and I was tested and I was put into ESL classes in high school as a freshman. That's how I saw that there were other people that not necessarily talk about our immigration status because it was a taboo. We didn't want to really tell others about our immigration status. It was something that we didn't want anybody to know. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to go to college. It was a hard time because I felt lost. I didn't know, the dream of my parents was for me to graduate from college, and I didn't know if I was gonna be able to make that dream come true. I had the blessing of a counselor who said, you know what, if we don't know, like she didn't know, but she said, go ahead and apply and we'll figure it out. I did apply to ASU, I got accepted, and I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I didn't have a chance to explore careers because I didn't have a social security number. And I was like, I remember going into ASU, and they show us different careers, and I thought, well, maybe an immigrant lawyer, like immigration lawyer. And I was like, no, I'm undocumented, I can't do that. And it was hard to see like the avenues that I wanted to do or my interests being like stopped by that wall of my immigration status. I decided to go into biochemistry, and that was in 2003. In 2006, Prop 300 was passed by 70% of the electorate in Arizona, and I heard what it was going to do. Essentially, what it meant to me as a young student, a young Latina at ASU, is going to triple my tuition. And as an undocumented student, I pay for every penny of my tuition before E-Verify, working in a fast food restaurant. I couldn't afford 3 times that tuition. So in 2009, because of Prop 300, I had to drop out with a semester and a class left. And I remember being in the kitchen with my parents and saying, I'm gonna have to put my dream on hold, because even if I find scholarships or whatever, I don't have a work permit, I won't be able to work. And I had a son at the time. My husband got sick and I had to continue working. They told me at work, you have to come Monday through Friday, we cannot work around your schedule anymore. I had to make the tough decision, and I told them it's on hold, it's on pause, and I was hopeful that I was gonna make it one day. DACA came about, and I was like, yes, now with DACA, we're going to be able to get a status and finish school. I remember former Governor Jan Brewer coming out and saying, no in-state tuition and no driver's licenses for DACA recipients. And I was like, wow, like again, right? My dreams crushed. I had to continue working, and I was lucky enough to have a support group once I got into the Arizona Dream Act Coalition, into that community of undocumented students like myself. And now with DACA, that some of them told me, hey, like, why don't you go back to school? So I did, paying out-of-state tuition, 1 class a semester, and I was able to graduate from Arizona State University with a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry. It did take 12 years to accomplish that. But every time I have the opportunity to tell students that si se puede, right? It might take longer, and it shouldn't. This is not fair, what's happening to us in the education system, to our Latino children. It shouldn't be the case, but there's hope. Like, we have to fight back, and we have to continue our education. I want to do science. I would have loved to look for the research of the COVID vaccine or the cure for cancer, but here I am, fighting to have a permanent status because DACA is temporary. So.
Well, thank you so much, and congratulations. Thank you for sharing your story with us. And Jose, it's kind of a perfect segue into the work you're doing at Aliento. Can you talk about some of the challenges and the barriers, that we just heard, and how that impacts students, not just K through 12, but also at the university level?
No, thank you for having me. I think this is a great panel.
Yeah.
Actually, Victoria and I went to the same high school. She's 2 years
Really?
older than me. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so same high school. I met Jeff 2010 during the immigration reform, and Karina in 2013, and I actually was a high school student, a college student when we created the Arizona Dream Act Coalition. Yeah. So I was one of the co-founders at the University at ASU. And that has kind of led me to the work that we're doing. As Karina mentioned, Prop 300 passed 2006. I was a high school senior. I was the first one in my family to go to university, the youngest of 4. All of them were undocumented. And there was a myth that existed that if you were undocumented, you were not eligible to enroll in university or college. So I kind of challenged that myth. I kind of have the rebellious aspect of my family. So my mom always told me that from a little kid, that you can't really just tell him no, you have to give him a reason, and if he doesn't like the reason, he's gonna figure out a way. So the work that we do at Aliento is like, how do we undo that past 16 years ago? So we've been working on competition for in-state tuition for undocumented DACA recipients since 2018. DACA recipients had briefly in-state tuition at the community college universities from 2015 to 2018, and at the community college from 2012 to 2018. So we saw that a lot of students, as Karina mentioned, dropped out because it was just too expensive. At the community college, you saw 50% drop out overnight once the tuition increased. Right now, there's about 1,800 students at the community college and universities who are undocumented or DACA recipients. But every year, 2,000 undocumented students graduate from Arizona high schools. If we change the policy, make it more inclusive and equitable, we think between 30 to 50,000 people are going to benefit here in Arizona directly. So for us, it's like, how do we
say that number again?
30 to 50,000.
30 to 50,000.
Yeah, those who have already a high school or equivalent degree. Like total population that will be eligible technically is 275,000, but a lot of those individuals are older, like my parents who came here to give people like us a better life and be an opportunity to be here in this sofa.
So from this conversation, you know, Jeff, this feels so much like some of our other conversations we had about the social determinants of education and how there's a lot of overlap here. And one of the common themes that we talk about a lot on this series is how can schools and communities start working together to really put support systems in place for immigrant students or students from immigrant parents?
Right, thank you for the question. So we've been talking about the social determinants of education, basically where you live, learn, work, and play out in the community. So what we're saying is that the conditions of our community don't stop at that classroom door. They seep into the classroom. So when you have a community that's been under attack by some of these policies and some of this rhetoric, it makes it really difficult for our community to engage successfully, not only in school, but in programs, in policing, in healthcare. So it's all tied into this sentiment of you're not welcome and you're not wanted. And it's so crazy to think about that there's so much talent in our community that overcome, right, all of the challenges and barriers that are being set up within the state of Arizona. And how much more value would we reap if we made education accessible, not only to college, but also really reinforcing English language learning, 8th grade math, and all of the indicators that we're tracking throughout the school experience. So social determinants of education, the school should be looked at as a hub, as a connection into different community sectors. And in order to do that, you have to be able to attract Latino and immigrant and mixed status families into that school system, because that's the natural place that you're going to go as a parent, because you're so invested in the education of your child. So if school administrators and schools are able to increase family engagement, we see in the research how that improves academic outcomes, not for a classroom or for a student, but for whole school districts. And lastly, schools also need to do a better job of being able to identify, diagnose, and refer once they're working with all students within their classroom to identify any type of need that comes across them and be able to successfully refer them to services out in the community.
So we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes in the panel, but Karina, I want to ask you, because you talked historically about some of the challenges. How about today? How do Arizona's and the U.S.'s immigration challenges impact schools today?
I think local and also federal, right? Locally, I have children. Now going back to that Victoria story about the mixed status families, and I very proudly said, we speak Spanish in the classroom and the registration form. Next thing I knew, my oldest one was placed in an ESL class when he was born here and has been a native English speaker. And I was like, wait, what's going on? So I didn't do that for my other two children, and they're in regular classrooms right now. But I do see that, as Jeff was mentioning, to go to a school board meeting for the district, I don't see people that look like me. And I think there's a big gap in the policies right now. Prop 300 also forbids people from obtaining adult class educations or childcare if they don't have a legal status or citizenship. So that's part of the continuous work that we need to do. And the first start is, again, to have that information, the resources, that community for immigrants in schools that they have a lot of students that are immigrants. And we don't see the school districts doing that because they don't look like us.
So we've been talking a little bit here about propositions, and we'll talk about another one that's creating a lot of buzz, Prop 308. So Jose, can you kind of define for us what's in it and what the benefits are for Arizona?
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, is basically is if you live in the state of Arizona for at least 2 years, attain a high school diploma or equivalent, whether it be a GED, homeschool, you'd be eligible for in-state tuition at the local community colleges and universities and access to scholarships. So that's one of the things that is important. I think one of the issues that we saw across the country is the rising cost of higher education. When I went to school, I was, I think 15 years ago at university, it's now almost 3 times as much. So when I think Karina started, it's like we've seen it increasing. And even if we have in-state tuition for folks, which is right now like 12,000 at universities, you still need that extra level of financial aid. So it does both, in-state tuition and financial aid.
So Karina, outside of Prop 308, what are some of the positive changes we might see? And I know you just talked about, attendance at school board meetings, but what are some of those other things or policies that can really help to support immigrant students and, students coming from immigrant families?
I think the best thing that could happen is immigration reform in the federal level. That is going to help take off the burden of students not knowing if they're going to come back from school and not have their parents present. I've seen it over and over at my children's school. It's definitely something that is a stress factor for these students when we ask them to perform. And also local policies to help adult immigrants, because they want us to speak the language, but they don't provide us with classes or resources to learn it. So I think that's a contradiction, and that has to do with the racism that happens in the state, which we need to change, not just in the state level, but start in the schools as well.
So Jeff, you just touched on this a few moments ago, and Karina was just talking about the stresses, and this is such sometimes a tough question to answer. What role do educators play in this scenario of supporting immigrant children and their families? What role do the teachers and educators play?
Well, it's a really tough question because we ask our teachers to do so much already, right?
Right.
So I think it's first and foremost, the teacher is a frontline worker when it comes to educating America's future, right? So teachers really need to be able to understand. I think we heard in our video how it's important to listen to understand and really listen to the lived experience of that immigrant child or that child from a mixed immigrant status family. But also, as I alluded to before, it's a U.S. constitutional mandate to provide a top-class education to everybody that enters the public school. And when we see those English language proficiency rates being at the bottom of every single population that we see within the schools, we need teachers, administrators, and school leaders to really attack this problem with the urgency necessary to change those dismal statistics.
So I was just going to prompt you here.
Yeah, I'm a former educator. I used to teach high school math for a couple of years in the West Valley, and one of the things that I did very well, because a lot of the teachers there didn't know. I don't think if educators, as Jeff mentioned, they're frontline workers. They give up their Saturdays, Sundays to prep, and they give up a lot of money to go buy supplies for the classroom. And you really don't have summer vacations. You have to go and work on the classroom and work on your curriculum. And educators care, they just don't know. A lot of them don't know. So a lot of the things that I did from my school, which was a little bit, not necessarily expecting everybody, but do a baseline training on just the language. What is the inclusive language to use? What words not to use? As Victoria mentioned, I remember some language that is used by educators, not they didn't want to harm, but it was just they just lack of knowledge. They use the I word, they use different type of language that is very hurtful to you as an immigrant. So that's one of them. The other one is welcoming. Can you create welcoming posters, flyers, or browse your classroom so people know that, because oftentimes coming out of the shadows is like coming out of the closet. It's something that it's not something that you feel comfortable with, because if you say that you're undocumented or you say your family member is undocumented, you don't know how that potential can be used. And there's been instances specifically in rural communities or in places outside of the urban cities where this has been policed and been informed and they have family members deported. So that's a lot of the things that educators can do in that sense, and school leaders and administrators can support them in that aspect of it. And I did a little bit of community outreach to some of the parents, and they wanted to know more about it. They just felt like the language barrier was an issue. They also working hours, have to have 2 or 3 jobs. So therefore, it falls upon, if you really want to support students and support families, you have to understand that you have to do extra steps, like create conferences, create town halls where people can come in and bring I think some of the work that All in Ed is doing in terms of it, I think they did our Haiti in high school, which was involve the parents after school, have cafecito night, something that they associate already to create a welcoming environment so people feel invested. And when community feels invested in a school, it's going to increase attainment.
And you just talked so much about a welcoming environment. What happens when it's not a welcoming environment and we're talking about stress on a student? How does that impact a student's outcome? Because you've seen it firsthand.
Yeah, it's every study that you see, if a student doesn't feel safe or is not welcome, they're not going to learn. You only learn if you feel safe. And one of the things that we were talking about specifically around immigrant students is oftentimes it's not that the school itself it might not be safe, but it's when you come into, you don't know if the parent was deported the night before. My dad was deported when I was 11 years old. And we can talk about it, but like, he was deported. It was a very traumatic experience. I don't remember a lot of it. I just remember the episode. Like there's several months that I have like blacked out. Like Phoenix police came and all this stuff. But later on, as an adult, my mom talked about it and talked about how like the teachers were calling that my sister was crying like out of the sudden in the classroom, that I had stopped eating, that I had stopped performing. So you have those things that are very severe. But then we have other ones, specifically right now with eviction notices, with housing, right? Undocumented people don't have that kind of protection because the landlord knows they're undocumented. They'll just say, hey, if you don't pay or if you don't leave, I'm gonna call the police. And what can you do? You talked about E-Verify, right? In the workplace and the abuses, people don't get paid hours. When I was undocumented, I didn't get paid the hours that I worked at, and I got paid way less than the minimum wage. You talk about healthcare. Another issue that impacts it, most of us don't have healthcare. So if something happens, you have to go figure out, you go to the neighborhood curandero, or you go to the places, the Salvadora, whatever that is, and hopefully you can heal okay. So all these things impact our students. So you're asking them to carry all this, jump in, hey, solve quadratic equations. Hey, let's solve the Pythagorean theorem. It's not something that is reasonable, right? So for us, it's like, how do we help as a society to make that structural change? Which is one of them, like we see it right, working a lot with ELL learners. And a lot of them are coming at 15, 16 years of age, 13, 14 years of age into the country, but they don't have that foundational background of education in their home country because they had to be working to support the family. So even then, even if you were to able to teach in their language, Spanish or the dialect, they still way behind because they don't have that foundation. So for us, it's like, it's just the way it seems to them, it's just like, I'm just being pushed out. So therefore I get to 16 and then they'll push me out of the schools. Some school districts do that and we're working with them. How do you change that? How do you understand that you have to do more? At least get them to the basics.
It's incredible to listen to your story and hear how it ties into so many of the other social determinants of education that we've talked about on the show. I do want to ask you a question about immigration because it always, or it's consistently, correlated to Latinos and individuals coming from Mexico, Central and South America. But Arizona does have a significantly large refugee population. So how familiar are either one of you with this issue and how this impacts the population?
Yeah, Arizona has the largest refugee population of Afghanis. That's something that the current governor made sure to have. We have a large Ukrainian, Eastern European population. Actually, went to school with a lot of Eastern Europeans. They have different obstacles, but they have similar obstacles in terms of racism, in terms of language. While Arizona is still dominated primarily, over 90% of the immigrant population comes from Latin America, it's been changing, specifically from Mexico. Since 2014, the net migration from Mexico has been negative. So more people leave who are Mexicans, leave Arizona than people come into Mexico from Arizona. So it's a different demographic. So people think about all these things, stereotypes that don't exist anymore. We have differences of changing. And a lot of that, as Corina mentioned, is about how do you translate in the language and interpret. Because sometimes when you translate or Google Translate, it doesn't actually interpret what we actually mean. And then the other thing that is important, I think that is we're dealing with overall is the cultural aspects, because not every single immigrant has the same culture, whether they're from the same region or from the same country.
Tying back to what Victoria said at the top of the show.
I think that I remember going into the PTO meeting and asking the principal at my children's school how many languages are spoken with students here, and I think she said something like 14, and I was like, wow, it's a K-8 school, and why don't I see signs in other languages, or I mean, maybe not in all 14, right? But at least a mix of the ones that are more predominant. And it's because I don't think that there's intentional steps to make that happen. So I think that's something that schools can do to try to be more inclusive and bring these families along. Yes, we say that The issues might be a little bit different because the refugees, usually they come with some sort of status, and they might not be completely undocumented. But as we talk about in-state tuition, it's even unaffordable for any student, right? So it's a bigger conversation, I think, about having more financial aid, having more access, and I think that the parents want to get involved, like Jose mentioned. I, as a parent, wanted to get involved, and I had to navigate the system knowing the language. So I always go to the PTO meetings to say, hey, listen, if there's no translator, I can help. I can volunteer myself to translate, because it's important that the parents know that they feel welcome because you're talking to them in their native language.
So let's talk about ways to get involved. And Karina, I'll start with you. What are some of the resources out there right now that can help immigrant students?
Parent Educator Academy.
Parent Educator.
They're all in education. It's commercial,
Yeah.
I'm telling you. I did it because of my children, and they helped me. Even though I am involved, I learned things that I was like, well, techniques, to help my children in school, and I saw the empowerment of many other parents. I think that's the way to go. Like, we need to really make intentional moves to bring these communities. And it was a lot of work, I'm pretty sure, because it was a group in English and a group in Spanish, right? But it really helped, and I really hope that it continues, that it gets stronger. I think I was the only parent from my district, so I'm gonna, encourage other parents in the district to join, because that's one of the things that I believe is gonna make the difference. Once parents get more involved in their children's education and we feel welcome. One of the things is seeing an SRO at our school does not help with welcoming immigrants. Because I know in my family, and I get the chills, I used to look in the rearview mirror if there was a cop behind me. And even nowadays that I have a driver's license with DACA, I still feel nervous when I have a cop behind me, because I know what that could mean if my mom's with me in the car as an undocumented person.
Jose, same question. What are some of those resources out there that are most valuable that you're seeing used today?
I think there are a lot of resources that exist out there. I think the problem is that the way, if we want to be more successful, which is something I think that Karina mentioned, is that we can't expect people to come to you. You have to go to them. And you have to go where they're going to be at. Whether they're going to be at the schools, typically you can do that, or whether they're going to be other places where they feel safe and welcome. Oftentimes, them coming to you, to your office, to the service, it's a little, they don't feel that, because it's like, I don't feel where I belong. Because as Victoria alluded, and you also, Jeff, is like, people don't feel, there's studies been shown, immigrant, specifically Latinos of immigrant households, 75% of them feel they're foreigners. They don't feel like they belong in the country. It's partly because of the way the systemic systems are, who's in like an office, but also what gets reinforced all the time. So it's like, how do you make them belong? And if sometimes you have to just go to, we offer some resources. You can go to alientoac.org/resources. There's the Parent Teacher Academy. There's other programs from the Department of Education, from ASU, from some of them, as well as from Education for Arizona. So there's a lot of resources, but I think for us, I want to actually challenge the organizations and the institutions to go to the parents, because oftentimes the parents have too much on their plate and they don't know which to choose, which is good and which is not, unless they get referred to somebody like Karina saying like, hey, this is a place, if you want to help your kid, this is where you need to go.
So as we wrap up this episode, my favorite part of these episodes is when we move into the call to action to the community. And we've already heard some great calls to action in this specific episode. But Jeff, after everything you've heard, we'll start with you. What would be that call to action to the community based on what we've heard today?
I have to agree with Karina. Let's look at the Parent Educator Academy, but not just the Parent Educator Academy, but how are school systems engaging families out of the community? What are the best practices? Who's doing it right? Who's doing it better? And can we learn from them? Because that school is the central hub of the whole community, and we have to make sure that it's an inviting place. The Parent Educator Academy, it's showing 90% attendance rates, 90% graduation rates. And what Karina said is that parents want to be involved. And when we hear from teachers and school administrators that they're not having anybody come to their school board meeting or to their cafecito or to their school meeting, we need to change it.
You guys are doing amazing things, obviously, and it's glad Stephanie and Anais are here to hear that live on stage in studio. It's tremendous. Some final thoughts as we wrap this conversation up, everything we've heard.
Like I mentioned, it's a lot of work, and I get it that we cannot expect the teachers to do it on their own. But I think that for organizations like Jose mentioned, like ours, we're thinking about doing a program also where we're going to like integrate the parents, at least in our area. And Arizona is so big, right? We cannot have enough organizations to support and be advocates for parents and students. So it's about taking action, I think, on both sides. Teachers to be advocates when they see that there's immigrant families that are in need of resources and in need of empowerment, and also for the local organizations to do that investment.
All right, Jose, wrap us up here. We've had quite a conversation. We've gotten emotional several times. Yeah. What are your final thoughts, and what's the call to action for the community?
For educators, showing that you care. When I came to the country, I actually failed the first grade. I was really behind in everything. I didn't know how to read or write in Spanish or English, and in that sense. But my first grade teacher, Ms. Montoya, always cared, and she would just show me that I care, and for me that helps. And I seen, even with my students, when my first year teaching, which I was not very good, I did my best, but sometimes I was like, this is just not that way helping. But my students would tell me later, you're like, I try and I did this because you showed me that you care. For us, if you want to get involved with us for the campaign, as Jeff mentioned, Prop 308, which means tuition for dreamers, you can go to bit.ly/Prop 308-in-state tuition. But if you don't want to do that, you can also email me at jose@alientoac.org. This is a transformation opportunity that has taken years in the making with the support of Karina, of Jeff, of Stephanie, of a lot of organizations out here supporting us, making sure that we make this a reality.
I'm going to give Ani some homework and put some of those links in the chats when we send this out. Thank you all.
To register to vote also.
Yes.
And participate. It's like the lottery. We don't win if we don't participate. So you need to vote, please. I cannot vote as a DACA recipient. It's so important that people do the research on the propositions. There's a lot of them, but there's groups putting together presentations about what each one is about. So please look up information in organizations and online, but please register to vote and participate this November.
Thank you. Well said. Thank you for joining us on this episode of All in Education's Sepas, the social determinants of education. As a reminder, we will continue to build on this conversation every single month, bringing you a deep dive conversation around each of the topics. So thank you, Jeff, Karina, and Jose. And Jeff, I know you want to thank the Garcia Family Foundation, correct?
Yeah, thank you to the Garcia Family Foundation, our sponsor, to being able to put on this Sepas series together.
All right, make sure you tune in next month as we discuss how the climate and the environment have continuously impacted families and students. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.